How's it going, everyone? Today we're going to be going over 3 supposedly true cryptid stories from Reddit. The last story included on here is actually a story that happened to me, so stick around to hear that. If you like content like this, feel free to subscribe and hit that like button. Alright, let's get right into the stories. For a little background before my story, I'm 16 now and this happened when I was 14, so it's still all pretty fresh in my mind. I've always been adventurous, being into all stereotypical things. Hunting, fishing, hiking, and just loving being in the woods. For a few years prior to my current house, I lived in a neighborhood with houses and concrete surroundings, so when we moved to the country, it was surreal to me. Over the span of a year, I explored every inch of the forest around us, except a small portion, only a few square miles on private property, probably about a mile away from my place. This will be important later. Finding a small lake, an old well, old ruins of stone homes, huge fields, and even springs in a small creek. But every time I went near what I call the third field, I always felt just a weird presence and a sense of dread every time I went near that place. I could feel the sense getting worse and worse the more I stayed, and especially when I was alone. I didn't feel like I was. I felt like there was always something just out of my sight watching. One day, on a Thursday in late fall, I decided to go on a hike later in the day than I usually did, on a trail I've walked countless times prior. It was a heavily traveled game trail, and I enjoyed walking because it connects other trails, and I could make a loop through the woods, trail to trail, to get back to my home. It ended up getting dark out, and I was barely able to see my hands in front of me. Luckily, I had my UV hunting flashlight in my pocket, which was dim, but enough to be able to see some of my surroundings. I then noticed how completely silent the woods were. No birds, crickets, owls, nothing. I started to get that feeling of dread creeping around me. Like before, something was tearing a hole in my back looking at me, and I started to pick up pace when I heard a screech, what I could only describe as a distorted version of a fox cry and a man dying. Hearing that, I bolted out of there, not caring where I was stepping, just running back home. Once I saw my porch lights and I was at the bottom of the hill that led up all the way to my yard, I decided to look back. But obviously I saw nothing. So I thought I was just being stupid and overreacting and telling myself it was just an animal, but deep down I knew whatever that thing was, it was not natural. I didn't tell my parents and ended up developing a deep curiosity to what I've heard. I needed to know what this was. Weeks later, I decided to trek out to the third field at dusk with my rifle in hand. I felt confident I could face whatever I found, but I was wrong. So very wrong. As I usually did, I slowly, carefully walked trail to trail, marking my way to that field. Coming up to it, I got a strange, strong feeling of fear and dread that I almost threw up. I promptly took the safety off my gun with my middle finger resting on the trigger. As darkness closed in on the forest, I slowly approached the brush at the edge of the field for cover. I looked through my scope on low magnification and almost screamed. In the middle of the field, there was a figure damn near 8 foot tall. Zooming in on my scope, I saw to my horror pale skin, looking almost like the bones were about to burst out of its skin. Black eyes like pits, covered in blood, holding a dead deer by its neck, and trails coming out of a perfect slice of its stomach. Crying at this point, I couldn't stop watching. I saw it rip the hide off the deer like it was nothing and stretch it over its grotesque body. At this point, I screamed. Its head twisted right towards me. It saw me. Then I remembered I had a gun and shot it. Stupid me. Why did I think shooting was a good idea? It screeched so loud, my ears bled. The same sound as I heard prior. I slammed to the ground. I ran so damn fast I heard crashing behind me like a hurricane, and it was getting closer and I knew it could catch up. I just knew it was coming. I jumped into a large mud hole from recent rain, praying that it wouldn't find me and I wouldn't become what that deer became. I waited, almost passing out, thinking this is how I die, getting ripped open by a malevolent being of unparalleled horror. Even with my dead ears, I could almost feel a weight lift off of me and felt it leave. I peeked my head out of the mud, seeing my chance. I ran, slinging my gun over my shoulder and chambering around. Running to my house, arm covered in blood and covered head to toe in mud, I stopped and thought, no one will believe me, as I hosed off outside and walked in. I felt like I was out there for days, but it's only gone about 2 hours. I put my gun away and I went to my bed. It's been 2 years now, and I'm honestly surprised I've been able to write this story. I just feel like I needed to talk about it and share this encounter. I still shake and have flashbacks to the thing I saw. On a vacation, I talked to an old guy and he said he knew a lot about cryptids. And I tried to figure out what the hell happened, and he said it could be an convict city, which is kind of more like an aggressive version of a skinwalker. And it could also just be a wendigo or a skinwalker. I still go in the woods and love nature, but ever since this experience, I can never look at the woods the same. I haven't told anyone this story yet. I have still been trying to find an answer. I have given up figuring out a logical explanation at this point. Please hear me out and let me know if this sounds like any other cryptid you know of. It was 3 days after Halloween. I live in southwest Georgia, and my home backs up to a rather large piece of forest. It was about 2 to 3 a.m., and I couldn't sleep, so I went on my back porch to read and smoke and have some tea. I was out there maybe 25 minutes when I suddenly heard what sounded like something heavy falling or jumping from a tree and hitting the forest floor violently. I thought maybe a tree fell at first, until right where I heard the noise come from, I immediately after began hearing what sounded like something walking around on all fours. Something large. Now I assume, probably a bear. This is an area with bears in it, so that would make sense to me. There's a fence directly in front of me, so I know I can dart inside before it can reach me. So I stay seated, curiously hoping to see this bear. My eyes set diligently on the dark forest. Then for a split second, illuminated by my porch light, I can see a shadowy figure of whatever it is. It wasn't furry, nor cute, nor a bear. It was all black, huge, limbering and humanoid, and crawling around on all fours, scurrying around, ducking and diving behind the trees maybe 15 feet in front of me in the darkness. And then the laughter begins. The best way to describe this laugh was like a stereotypical witch with some uncanny animalistic distortion. So it was cackling so loudly, psychotically, manically, mockingly. I thought surely my neighbors would be coming outside at any moment. I was absolutely frozen in fear. I couldn't move. I didn't want to move. I thought if I did, whatever it would give chase. So I sat frozen, staring back blankly at the forest that mocked me. This laughing, staring match went on for about 3 long minutes. Finally, I found the courage to look down enough to grab my phone and record a video with flashlight. The moment the flashlight hit the trees, the laughter subsides. But the scurrying around continues. Finally, I yell, "Fuck this," and dash inside. A week later, I was awake late again, and this time in my bedroom, and I heard what sounded like human footsteps running around my roof in circles that lasted maybe 4 to 5 minutes. This was the last anything that's happened though. I moved into this new place back in July. When I first arrived, items kept disappearing and reappearing, but eventually that stopped again too. I just don't know what to make of any of this. Any advice or knowledge or anything at all is appreciated. I don't know what I saw as a kid. Looking for possible answers or similarities. Tonight I was talking to my partner about weird childhood experiences growing up. Now that I rehabbed this story from my childhood, it gives me chills down my spine. For starters, I grew up in northern Michigan, about an hour south of the bridge right on the banks of Lake Huron. My aunt lived about half an hour north on an inland lake with her husband and 4 kids. I have 2 specific memories from her house that haunt me to this day. The first one is probably when I was 5 years old. And when I say I remember this so clearly, vividly, I'm not lying. My aunt lived right on a large inland lake. To the left of her, she had a handful of neighbors, but to the right of her house, it was all swamps for about a quarter of a mile besides about 100 feet of yard that was all hers. As kids, my 2 older cousins and I would poorly swing golf balls into the swamp, and then we ran out of balls, we would go look for them in the swamp. This specific day, our large family was throwing a barbecue. My grandpa was watching us 3 grandchildren hit the balls into the swamp, and so the rest of our family was hanging out on the porch on the opposite side of the house. I remember hitting my ball almost completely to the left, so not straight out in front where the rest of the golf balls were, typically being poorly hit. My little 5-year-old self ran through the ditch to the swamp to go retrieve my poorly swung ball. Once I reached the swamp, I looked around and could not find where my ball had gone. I remember turning right and seeing this strange, faceless figure standing about 10 feet away from me. To describe this figure is that it was human-shaped and had absolutely no detail at all when it came to facial features. No fingers, no toes, no genitals, anything like that. It was completely blurred, almost if it was nudity being blurred out on a television screen. Its arms were swinging violently back and forth. I immediately screamed and started crying and ran to my grandpa. My other family running over to ask what was wrong, and I told them, of course, after checking the woods, they found nothing. A couple years ago, I brought it up to my grandpa, and he said he remembers me doing that. It was just so strange, because when I try to find possible cryptids or explanations when I came to that, I can't find anything, because the part with its arms vibrating and swinging is just so weird. Of course, there are faceless features and whatnot, but does anyone know of anything doing that? This wasn't my only experience at the lake house, though. The next memory I remember perfectly, because it was much more recent and, well, not too recent. I was actually 12. I'm currently 24. Anyways, it was another night I was spending out at my aunt's house. My mom used to work the night shift, so I used to spend a lot of time at nights out with my aunts and cousins. However, this particular night, 3/4 of my cousins were gone at sleepovers, leaving me with my 3-year-old cousin at the time, my aunt, and just my uncle. I remember we were watching Who Framed Roger Rabbit on the television in the living room. I fell asleep on the love sack in the corner of the living room, which is very typical at the time. The living room was facing the swamp side of the house, and 2/3 of the wall were almost just straight window with no curtains. We didn't need curtains though, you had no neighbors, just some lakefront yard and a swamp. I remember waking up to the sound of knocking. I remember looking at the time on the CD player beneath the TV, and it was 2:08 in the morning. My first thought was their dog Doc was wagging his tail, and his tail was hitting the coffee table out in front of me. I remember verbally saying out loud, "Doc, stop it." The knocking continued, and I kept yelling at the dog to calm down, for Doc was extremely energetic and still young at the time. When the sound didn't stop, I sat up in frustration and looked around for the dog, but Doc wasn't anywhere to be found. Instead, I realized the knocking was coming from behind me, so I turned around and saw a large, faceless figure, probably 7 feet tall, knocking on the window behind me. I always described this figure as what an old scuba diver would wear, as if the outline of his body was a vintage scuba suit, but what it's technically called is a Mark V dress. I remember instantly running to my aunt's room and shaking her and my uncle awake, telling them there's a man knocking on the window. My uncle goes the lengths to go outside. He himself is a 6'5", 240-pound man, and he comes back and says he didn't see anything. The rest of the night, I slept next to my aunt because I was so terrified. It's a story I still tell today. I don't have any more experiences from her house, but as I grew older, I stopped spending so much time out there. I asked my aunt recently if she's ever had any weird experiences at that house. She said that when she built her garden, large amounts of birds used to get stuck and die in the fence, and she used to have to wake up extra early to clear them before any of us kids noticed. She said daily blackbirds got stuck in the chicken wire, and she said at least 7 a day. Strange thing, she said it only happened for a month and then just randomly stopped. She thought someone was playing a nasty prank on her, but never got to the bottom of it. Another time, she said she was digging in the same garden, which by the way is very near the spot of my first story. She found an old rusted skeleton key buried in cloth, which is strange because the house is relatively newer, but she doesn't know how old this land could be or the history. I just wanted to share this story and see if anyone else has some similar stories. This last story is a personal story that doesn't come from Reddit and actually comes from my own experience. Me and my friends like to travel in the Adirondack Mountains, and we usually stay at a cabin that belongs to my grandpa. As many people are, we have been deeply intrigued with the unknown throughout our lives. This trip we decided to dedicate to finding something. We went out with the intentions of searching the area where a mysterious missing persons case has occurred. We went out to hike in the area, didn't find anything, and then we eventually returned to the cabin. When nightfall struck, we decided to go on another hike, this time on the road right outside our camp. We were walking side by side using a flashlight and an infrared camera, with us looking down the path and right in front of us. As we continued down the road, we heard a rustling of leaves followed us, faintly jumping from each side of the path. Anxiously, we continued walking. We approached a small hill. When I shined the flashlight towards the peak of the hill, there was a 6-foot white creature standing on 2 legs staring at us. At first sight, we were shocked and froze in place, but very quickly this wore off and we turned and started running. As we were sprinting back to the camp through the dark path, we could hear the unknown creature following us and giving chase. Eventually, we finally made it back to the camp, and thankfully we were unharmed. If you want to see and visualize this encounter, we actually did record this, so if you guys want to check out that footage and let us know what you think it is, check that out. I will have it linked in the description. Thank you guys for listening, and if you want to hear more videos like this, please subscribe.